Tonight, an Indianapolis man is preparing to spend the next 4 decades in prison for the murder of his ex-wife's new husband. Back in 2022, Stefen Lowe drove to an Indianapolis church where his ex-wife was attending a funeral. That's when police say he opened fire, shooting and killing Jermaine Turman.
It should have been a day for mourning, not murder. A newlywed husband gunned down at his mother-in-law's funeral by his wife's ex. Welcome to Crime Gone Viral, where we bring you true stories that shake the soul and fracture the silence. Today's case isn't just about jealousy. It's about obsession, betrayal, and a love triangle that turned deadly. This is the tragic, tangled story of Alan Jermaine Turman, a man who waited 15 years for the woman of his dreams, only to be killed protecting her. And the aftermath left more questions than closure. It was a Saturday morning in November. The sky over Indianapolis hung heavy, gray, still expectant. Inside the oasis of Hope Baptist Church, the air was thick with sorrow. Family and friends had come together for a solemn farewell. They gathered to honor the life of Shannon Turman's mother, a woman deeply loved and now gone. It should have been a sacred space, a quiet, sacred goodbye. But what unfolded in the next few minutes would turn a funeral into a crime scene and leave an entire community in stunned silence. In the crowd that day was 42-year-old Alan Jermaine Turman. Just months before, Alan had married the love of his life, Shannon Taylor, a woman he'd known for 15 years, a friend, a confidant, a second chance at forever. He stood at the front of the church, dressed in black, his hands steady as he carried the weight of the casket, a man grieving the loss of his mother-in-law and ready to help his wife carry that burden, side by side. But what Alan didn't know was that death wasn't finished with their family, because just outside the church, another man was waiting, watching, waiting. His name was Stefen Lowe, Shannon's ex-husband, the man she had divorced only months earlier. And on this day, this sacred day, he wasn't there to pay respects, he was there for revenge. He parked a white vehicle just feet from the church entrance. Witnesses say he wore a grin, not of grief, but of something darker, something calculated, the kind of smile that knows what's about to happen and welcomes it. Stefen Lowe stepped out of the car, raised a gun, and shot Alan Turman in the chest, in front of Alan's own mother. In an instant, a life was taken, a family shattered, a wedding ring stained in blood. Alan Turman was a husband, a son, a protector, and on the day he helped bury one life, his own was stolen. What kind of hatred drives a man to pull the trigger at a funeral? This is the story of Alan Jermaine Turman, a man who married for love, but died defending it. And it all started with a love triangle no one saw coming. They say the best relationships start as friendships. That love rooted in history is harder to shake. For Shannon Taylor and Alan Jermaine Turman, that history was 15 years long. For over 15 years, Alan Jermaine Turman had been a steady presence in Shannon Taylor's life. The kind of friend who stuck around through the noise, through the storms, through it all. He watched her fall in love with someone else, watched that love turn toxic. And when Shannon finally walked away from her first marriage, Alan was there. Not to say I told you so, but to offer something deeper, safety, comfort, and maybe another chance. Alan wasn't just another guy in her inbox. He wasn't a new flame or a fleeting rebound. He had been there for over a decade, a quiet constant in the background of her life. When her world began to fall apart, he stepped in. In February 2022, Shannon filed for divorce from Stefen Lowe. It had been a turbulent marriage, one shadowed by allegations of violence, a protective order, and years of emotional warfare. To the outside world, it might have seemed too soon for new love. But for Shannon, Alan wasn't new. But just 6 months later, Shannon was walking down the aisle again, this time to Alan. Some called it romantic, others too soon. But to them, it felt right. The man who had waited 15 years to hear her say, "I do." To Shannon, Alan was more than a husband. He was her safe space, her knight in shining armor, her best friend turned soulmate. And for Alan, it may have felt like the culmination of a long, patient pursuit. A friend turned wife, a dream fulfilled. This wasn't just love, it was validation. All those years spent on the sidelines were finally over. They didn't just fall in love, they made it public, loud, joyful, unapologetic. Their social media was flooded with videos of their affection. They danced, they joked, they gushed. Inside jokes became public declarations. What neither of them could predict, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, was that they weren't alone in this love story. Someone else was watching. And with every video they posted, every "I love you," every new wedding photo, they were striking a match on a powder keg. Watching from the sidelines, growing more bitter by the day, was Stefen Lowe. Stefen wasn't just watching, he was spiraling. To him, this wasn't a new beginning for Shannon, it was a betrayal. And Alan? He wasn't the knight in shining armor. He was the man who stole his wife. At least, that's how Stefen saw it. He wasn't just seeing his ex-wife happy, he was seeing her happy without him. A man like Stefen Lowe didn't just want Shannon back, he wanted control. He wanted access to her life, her body, her business. Reports would later reveal that he wasn't content just losing the marriage. He wanted 50% of her business. And when she refused, he wanted blood. Alan married the woman of his dreams, but that dream was already being hunted. Their love, innocent and joyful on the surface, was becoming public, and that publicity had a cost. Every like, every comment, every share felt like a dagger to a man who still believed she was his. 3 people, 1 broken bond, and a deadly equation. 1 woman trying to rewrite her story, 1 man trying to protect her, and 1 man who refused to be erased. Coming up, how a man's desperate need for control set the stage for one of the most brazen murders Indianapolis has ever seen. Every love story ends in one of 2 ways, heartbreak or haunting. For Shannon and Alan Turman, love was their second chance. But shadows from Shannon's past didn't want to let go. His name? Stefen Lowe. To the world, he was just her ex-husband. To Shannon, he was a ghost that refused to die. Divorce didn't break him. It ignited something far more dangerous. Court records revealed a descent, from bitterness to obsession to blood-chilling rage. Stefen wanted more than Shannon back. He wanted revenge. He wanted control. And in his twisted mind, that meant taking half of Shannon's new business, the very one she built to escape him. When she refused, the messages began. The visits, the stalking, the promises of destruction. It wasn't just harassment. It was psychological warfare, a calculated campaign to isolate, intimidate, and dominate. And then came the protection order, a legal boundary meant to shield, but Stefen saw it as a dare. Stefen had a record, weapons charges, a history of domestic violence, invasion of privacy, a felon with nothing to lose. Yet Shannon, in love again, didn't see the storm gathering. For every public display of love, Stefen built a deeper reservoir of hate. For every laugh, he sharpened his silence. This wasn't jealousy. This was obsession metastasizing. He followed. He watched. He waited. Because obsession doesn't fade. It festers. And Stefen Lowe wasn't just stuck in the past. He was planning a future. One where Shannon and Alan didn't exist. No restraining order could contain his rage. No courtroom could stop his spiral. And no one, not even Shannon, realized just how far he was willing to go. But Shannon and Alan didn't run. They didn't hide. They thought it was just talk, the last desperate gasps of a bitter man. But Stefen had already made his decision, and the countdown had begun. Some people show you exactly who they are, but we convince ourselves they're bluffing, that they're angry but not dangerous, that their words are heat of the moment, not a warning shot. But sometimes the moment you write off a red flag is the moment it starts waving in blood. If love was a fire, Alan and Shannon were burning bright. But in the shadows, something darker was beginning to smolder. Every declaration of love, every romantic video, every shared laugh, filtered and captioned, was being watched. Not by fans, but by a man unraveling. His name was Stefen Lowe, and he wasn't just an ex-husband. He was a man in slow collapse. Court documents would later reveal a grim picture, a history of violence, of manipulation, and of deep-seated control. By late 2022, Stefen Lowe wasn't just simmering in silence. He was boiling over, in texts, in voicemails, in comments that anyone paying attention could see. But Shannon had moved on. She'd chosen love. And for Stefen, that was intolerable. Despite a protective order barring him from contact, Stefen continued, messaging, harassing, threatening. And then came the mistake no one saw as a mistake, going public. Their love wasn't just personal. It was now a performance, a celebration, a signal that they had moved on. To Shannon, it was healing. To Alan, it was happiness. To Stefen, it was humiliation. And Stefen, he was still watching. Watching Shannon laugh with another man. Watching Alan hold the woman he still claimed as his. Watching the world cheer them on. Alan, ever the loyal husband, stepped up. He wasn't going to let another man intimidate his wife. He called Stefen, told him to stop, told him they weren't scared, but they should have been. The threats kept coming. So did the online accounts. New names, new messages, same twisted obsession. Behind the public joy was private dread. They filmed dances, skits, shared kisses on camera. They were trying to build a new life, but the past had no intention of staying buried. Every event they planned, Stefen warned he might crash. Every milestone, he promised to ruin. And still, Shannon and Alan pressed forward. They shared their happiness with the world. They laughed. They celebrated. And all the while, the countdown had already begun. There were signs, clear ones. But when you're trying to feel joy again after surviving pain, you want to believe the storm is behind you. By October, the walls were closing in. The danger wasn't hiding anymore. It was inching closer. He was planning. He was tracking their every move. On socials, at events, at home. He knew where they'd be. He knew when they'd be alone. And he knew the perfect time to strike. And no one could say they weren't warned. What Shannon and Alan didn't realize was that the funeral they were about to attend would become their judgment day.
When he came in, I was very shocked, like a deer in headlights, like, what is he doing here? He had the weirdest smile on his face, like an evil grin.
For months, she says she and her husband, Jermaine, have lived in fear of her ex-husband. She said he'd been harassing them and threatening to kill them.
He had that anger in him that if I can't have you, nobody can have you kind of attitude. And he actually told me and Jermaine that he owned me.
On Saturday, Shannon says her ex made good on those threats by starting a fight with Jermaine and shooting him in the church parking lot.
He did this in front of my son and in front of Jermaine's mother and at my mother's funeral. Like, those three things alone is like, what frame of mind are you in to go to a funeral and kill someone?
November 5th, 2022. On a cold Saturday morning in Indianapolis, friends and family gathered to grieve. A day for grief, a day for reverence, a day to say goodbye to a beloved mother, grandmother, and matriarch, the heart of Shannon Turman's family. The service was held at Oasis of Hope Baptist Church, a place meant for solace and healing. Inside, rows of pews were filled with tear-streaked faces. The smell of lilies drifted through the air. Soft hymns filled the sanctuary. Family members clutched folded tissues, held hands, and leaned on one another, preparing to bury a pillar of their home. Alan Turman, Shannon's new husband, wasn't just there to support her. He was serving as a pallbearer, shouldering the weight of his wife's grief, both literally and emotionally. A final act of honor for the woman who had become his mother-in-law. For Shannon Taylor, it was a chance to say goodbye to the woman who raised her. For her new husband, Alan Jermaine Turman, it was a day to support his wife through one of life's hardest goodbyes. The service began peacefully, words of comfort, testimonies of love, tears falling silently onto polished wood. The Oasis of Hope Baptist Church sat quiet in the early hours, the kind of quiet that comes with mourning, with finality. But outside, another kind of energy was building, one that had no place among hymns and healing. Without warning, Stefen Lowe pulled into the parking lot, uninvited, unannounced, undeterred. Without warning, Stefen Lowe pulled into the parking lot, uninvited, unannounced, undeterred, and undeniably unhinged. Shannon and Alan had feared he might come, but hoped he wouldn't dare. They were wrong. According to witnesses, Stefen walked into the service, not with grief in his eyes, but something else, something colder. He wore what Shannon would later describe as an evil grin. A smile meant to unnerve, not to mourn. A look like he knew exactly what he was about to do and was proud of it. The tension crackled like static in the air. The church, a place of refuge, instantly transformed into a powder keg. Alan spotted him first. Protective instincts kicked in. He approached Stefen. This wasn't the time. This wasn't the place. He told Stefen to leave, to respect the sanctity of the space, to let the family bury their dead in peace. But Stefen didn't back down. He became belligerent, loud, disruptive. A sacred ceremony now hijacked by rage. Two men, both tied to the same woman, now tangled in a battle that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with control. Voices rose. Crowds gathered at the doorway, watching what felt like a storm breaking open. The two men argued, then fists flew. A physical altercation erupted in the church parking lot. Funeral attendees, already emotionally raw, rushed to break it up. ... Funerals are meant for closure, not carnage. But as Shannon Turman grieved the loss of her mother, as Alan helped carry that casket toward its final resting place, death was circling back. The earlier confrontation with Stefen Lowe had shaken the crowd. His disruptive presence, his threats, his rage. But when he left the church grounds, people thought it was over. They were wrong. Alan's mother, Pamela, had seen too much in her life already. 7 years earlier, she lost her daughter in a hit and run. Now, at 61 years old, she was burying her daughter-in-law's mother. But even through all of that loss, she knew this moment felt different. But what happened next would break her in ways no mother should ever have to experience. She rushed to his side, hands trembling, trying to stop the bleeding, trying to call out for help that didn't come fast enough. She watched her son, her only surviving son, fall to the pavement in front of her. The same child she had raised, comforted, protected, now bleeding out at her feet. He was gone. In the same parking lot where he had honored the memory of his wife's mother, Alan Turman was murdered in front of his own. Stefen Lowe drove away. No guilt, no remorse, just silence. But that silence would soon be shattered by sirens. Alan's body remained on the pavement, covered, surrounded by sobbing family, a wedding ring still on his finger. The chaos had ended. The tragedy had just begun. In less than 60 seconds, Alan's life was erased, not in a war zone, not in some back alley, not in a drug deal gone bad, in a church parking lot, while helping bury his wife's mother, while his mother watched. What do you do when the man who promised to protect you dies doing just that? When grief turns into trauma, and a funeral becomes a murder scene. For Shannon, the nightmare was far from over, because what she did next would shock everyone. One week, that's all they needed. Just one more week, and they would have celebrated the beginning of a new chapter, a wedding reception full of laughter, dancing, and love. The venue was booked, the menu was paid for, the decorations were delivered. It was supposed to be their beginning. Instead, it became his ending. But the bride no longer had a groom. The Keystone Event Center, once reserved for celebration, became a sanctuary for sorrow. Instead of dancing, guests cried. Instead of speeches about love, there were eulogies. Instead of toasts, prayers. The balloons that were meant to float in joy now floated in remembrance. The catering wasn't canceled. The guests still came. But instead of champagne toasts, there were condolences. In the span of a single weekend, Shannon Taylor lost her mother and her husband. 2 funerals, 2 deaths, one heart struggling to survive it all. No one prepares for that. Jermaine Turman wasn't just a husband. He was a father, a brother, a comedian at heart. He loved making people laugh, loved showing joy. And there was one thing he always wanted to do, but never had the chance. He always wanted to learn how to skate. So Alan's sister, Letitia Crome, decided to honor him the only way she knew how. She hosted a memorial at Roller Cave, a local skating rink. In a space filled with motion, they honored a life that had been cut short far too soon. They spun around the rink, some stumbled, some glided, but every movement was for Alan. Cheering, laughing, living, if only in memory. For his family, this wasn't just about grief. It was about refusing to let Alan's joy die with him. If he never got the chance to roll onto that rink, then his people would roll for him. It was beautiful. It was painful. It was the kind of send-off only he would have appreciated. Then came Alan's birthday. He would have turned 43. His mother, Pamela Grant, organized a balloon release. Simple, powerful. Just her, his sister, and his son. But there was one face missing. The woman he died protecting. Shannon wasn't there. And that absence would ignite a controversy no one saw coming. Stefen Lowe was no longer hiding. The man who murdered Alan Turman in cold blood was now in custody. In the days following the funeral shooting, Indianapolis police quickly identified and arrested him. The evidence was overwhelming. Eyewitnesses, a protective order, a motive carved in jealousy and rage. Alan had died defending love. Stefen had acted on hate. The case, it seemed, was open and shut. But this wasn't going to be a clean courtroom victory. Not for Alan's family, not for the public, because Stefen Lowe took a deal. In the American legal system, a guilty plea is often seen as a shortcut to justice, a way to avoid the emotional toll of a trial. But for the family of Jermaine Turman, it felt more like a discount on murder. In August of 2024, nearly 2 years after Alan's life was taken in a church parking lot, 35-year-old Stefen Lowe stood before Judge Mark Stoner. He did not contest the facts. He did not maintain his innocence. Instead, he took a deal. Stefen pleaded guilty, not to murder, but to a reduced set of charges: voluntary manslaughter, invasion of privacy, unlawful possession of a firearm by a serious violence felon. And just like that, the murder charge was dropped. 40 years. That was the price the court placed on Alan's life. Some saw it as justice. Others saw it as a discount. There was no trial, no cross-examination, no testimony from Alan's family. No opportunity to look Stefen in the eyes and ask, why? To some, it felt like closure was stolen, again. Alan had been the protector, the peacekeeper, the man who believed in love, even when it put him in danger. And now, the man who ended his life, in front of family, in sacred space, would avoid a murder conviction altogether. Alan's story is not just a crime of passion, it's a warning. A reminder that the most dangerous person in your life might be the one who can't accept that your story with them is over. But it's also a lesson in courage. Alan Turman died protecting someone he loved. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He stood tall. And while justice was partial, his legacy doesn't have to be. Let his story remind you to recognize the red flags, to take threats seriously. to protect yourself and those you love, because love should never cost your life. If you or someone you know is in a dangerous relationship, don't wait for it to become fatal. Reach out. Get help. You don't need to be a martyr to prove your love. Jermaine Turman deserved better. A longer life, a safer love, a better ending. But if his story helps even one person walk away from someone who won't let go, then maybe in some way, he didn't die for nothing. Don't forget to like this video, comment your thoughts below. Subscribe to Crime Gone Viral for more stories that don't just inform, they hit home. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and remember, love should never cost you your life. God bless you.